Hamburg. For me, this is a wonderful break after a pretty tough trimester, so I'm delighted to be here, despite the grey skies. I'm going to begin with a couple of quite bold statements. For those of you who don't know, my background's a bit different from a typical academic. I've spent a lot of my life in finance and banking, and one of my roles was as a fund manager. So it's a natural, reporting is a natural area for me to talk about because I've actually read literally thousands of reports over the years, and I still do. I still invest in companies so that I understand how financial markets work in practice. But I guess because of my background, I understand how disclosures are used, how the information flows, and what institutional investors and retail investors do with information. So given that reporting background, I've continued to look at both the law and practice in reporting. And the bold statements that I'm going to make is that I think that international company reporting law and practice are undergoing a paradigm change. I'm a bit of a cynic, and so this has actually surprised me at just how much change is going on. And I think the most dynamic area of change at the moment is in this area of sustainability reporting. Many people use the term financial reporting and non-financial reporting. I think there's all kinds of problems actually with those terms, but I haven't got time to talk about that today. But I will say that those areas are linked, and it's important to understand that. Supply chain management and reporting is emerging as a new area. It has been around for quite a while, but I think it's now receiving a lot more focus than in previous times. And I think this is being driven by the signatories of corporations to the United Nations Global Compact principles. And of course that creates many benefits and challenges, and I'm going to talk about those a bit later. But if you're looking at reporting, in any area of reporting, corporate law reporting, the problem is always the quality of reporting. That's where the focus generally ends up. And I think the quality of reporting I feel really passionate about because I think communication between corporations and not just shareholders but the broader community of stakeholders is the key proxy, if you like, or the nexus between the life of what's going on. And that quality of reporting is not divorced from the business, and institutional investors acknowledge that. And there's quite a few studies where institutional investors actually say that they use the quality of reporting as a proxy for the quality of management. There isn't always a nexus, but often there is. If I read a report and I think it's completely waffly, I can't understand what the company's saying, that's a pretty good indicator that the business probably doesn't know what they're doing either. All right, so that was my introduction. I'm just going to take a moment to look at the bigger picture. In my view, the role and impact of reporting law, particularly within sustainability and supply chain spheres, is poorly understood by corporations themselves, particularly by scholars, and also by stakeholders. And sometimes I feel as though I'm operating in a different world from what's being discussed in the literature, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. There's also very little good debate, I think, around what is quality reporting. So there's certainly a lot of studies that say that the reporting quality is poor, but very few scholars, and indeed others, describe what they mean by good quality reporting. So I hope to comment on that a bit. In all of my work, probably because of my background, I try and support my arguments using empirical research. So I tend to go and have a look at studies within the accounting, marketing, economic, and sometimes law studies, and I use that empirical research to support the arguments, because I actually think it's really important that the debate is grounded in what's happening in reality. Of course, reporting isn't the be and all. It's only one part of policy tools that are available. And there are many structural barriers and limitations with reporting regimes. And I've certainly published on that. And if I get time today, I'll touch on some of those limitations. So all those bigger picture issues play into the quality and the challenges around supply chain reporting, because arguably supply chain reporting is the most complex form of company reporting. But before I move to talk about supply chain, let's just consider why quality corporate reporting is important. And this is the best quote I've found anywhere in the world. I'm proud to say it comes from New Zealand, which is my home country. And the Institute of Directors in New Zealand recently stated that good corporate reporting supports good corporate governance. I believe that. I don't believe you can have good corporate governance without good reporting, or at least good communication. And the underlying principles of accountability, transparency, probity, and long-term business sustainability. Thoughtful reporting focused on performance also promotes shareholder and stakeholder confidence and trust. That's something I also passionately believe. But of course, the real challenge is that good governance practice requires reporting that is open and meaningful. That is the challenge. I think for those of you that have read reports, not many of them you would probably describe as being open and meaningful. There are some, but not enough. So do I believe that reporting regimes are effective today? I've analysed in various books and publications, I've analysed the reporting regimes and the effectiveness of them in most developed nations. All have issues, but I think it's always important to take the half-glass full approach. I don't think it's helpful to say that reporting is useful, or on the other end of the spectrum that it's the only useful policy. I think it's important to recognise its benefits and its challenges, and that it's also important to acknowledge that there are companies out there that are doing their utmost and really striving to report openly and candidly. So it's not that there are no companies doing the right thing, there are some that do. But the reality is that reporting is highly political. And every time I look at the introduction of reporting law or strengthening of reporting law anywhere in the world, you can see these indicators of business resistance. And so what we end up with typically is new or enhanced corporate disclosure rules that are principle-based, because that allows a whole lot of discretion. They're usually very non-specific, particularly in form and content. The supervision and enforcement of most reporting law is truly light touch, if it's supervised at all. The one country actually that I would describe as the exception is the United States. I actually think the disclosure law is much better understood there than in any other country. Right, so because of this highly political nature, reporting law is problematic in most countries because of this large amount of discretion that companies have that allows them to then put out reports that say very little. They might have, I've literally read reports of 600 pages that say you still can't figure out what the true principles of the business are. That is just complete waffle, motherhood statements, and it's very difficult to supervise that kind of reporting, particularly because what I would call as management discussion and analysis is very hard to enforce. And indeed, the only country in which it's enforced is the United States. So moving now to supply chain reporting, which is a subset, of course, of other reporting. As I mentioned, I think that the supply chain reporting is being driven by the membership of the United Nations Global Compact. I do not believe at this stage anyway that law is having a major impact in this area. It's being driven by institutional investors. Institutional investors that are committed and activists are really pressurising companies to become a member, and they're then pressurising companies in terms of the quality of their reporting. And I'm surprised. This really is having an impact. It is having a paradigm change. Companies are changing their reporting, and they are reporting on areas that previously they just didn't engage with. When you look at reports, I think I've analysed, I look at the third-party research, but I also try and look at about 200 companies from around the world each year, just so I'm up to date on what the current standards are. Most of the companies that are members of the United Nations Global Compact would say that they're reporting on all 4 areas, and those 4 areas are environment, health and safety, human rights, and anti-corruption. But when you actually look at the empirical studies and based on my own reviews, the reality is that most companies are putting in some kind of commentary on the environment, and the most common metric is in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, and the reason for that is because it's a win-win scenario. Most companies include some limited forms of information on employees, health and safety, suppliers, the community, philanthropy, and some metrics. The weakest areas are human rights and anti-corruption, and those are the areas that are very difficult to report on, so that's not surprising. They're also the most difficult ones to supervise and enforce. Overall, the supply chain reporting is still evolving. So what are the current practices? Well, what's driving the supply chain reporting is undoubtedly commercial, right? What I mean by that is what's motivating companies to do this is that there are commercial returns, right? Commercial benefits. Companies are recognising that. The way that companies are operating their supply chain reporting is typically through a supplier code of conduct, and that is then sometimes contractual, and that's cascaded down various tiers. So in their contract, they then require their own suppliers to then have contracts with their suppliers, and so forth down the train. And I think this is it has the potential, it's obviously got limitations, but it has the potential to provide information that previously would not have been available. Most companies monitor the conduct of their suppliers through surveys. In some cases, there are audits by the controller company, and sometimes third parties are involved. The controller companies often provide guidance to their suppliers, mentoring, and they provide workshops. Sometimes the control companies require their suppliers to be certified. They provide them with an incentive or a stick, if you like. And sometimes compliance with the code is required for selection as a supplier. So in other words, the suppliers have no choice. What are the benefits and what drives the commercial returns? Well, it builds closer relationships with the suppliers, and that because of that and the increased integration with the suppliers, that can generate real efficiencies and commercial returns. This is not a new phenomena. My background, I've actually spent quite a lot of time working in Japan, and you may have heard of the just-in-time systems in Japan, which have taken off globally. And that's about managing the inventory through the supply chain, all right? So this is not a new phenomena. The reality is that if companies manage their supply chain more efficiently, there can be massive commercial benefits from doing so. There can also be, of course, improved relationships with all of the various stakeholders. And that can build better trust, which then can build a better reputation, better brand, and again, that can have commercial benefits. The companies, by doing their work with the suppliers, can also get a better understanding of their own business, of their products and of their services, and again, that can have commercial benefits. They can have greater awareness of the impacts of their activities. It can perhaps build capacity for innovation, and as I mentioned, it can build a better reputation and brand. So that's what's driving the supply chains at the moment, in my view. From the company's perspective, there are real challenges. Of course, it's time-consuming and costly. Many companies may feel that they have a lack of control, particularly when the supply chain goes beyond the company boundaries, which inevitably it will if you're really dealing with all your suppliers. Some of those might be independent contractors, but some of them the company may have no direct relationship with. So that means that there can be limited avenues for redress because the contract is only with the direct suppliers. And of course that is one of the major limitations of supply chain reporting. One of the challenges for companies though is it can extend their liability, and it can certainly extend the scrutiny accountability. So environmental groups, for example, and indeed human rights groups are now beginning to use the supply chain reporting as a means of holding companies to account. And I've actually started to list various examples of this. So I think it can be a mechanism for some form of accountability, albeit a limited form of accountability. More broadly, what are the benefits of supply chain programs? Well, as I say, there are some companies, and these companies are diversely situated, that are genuinely striving to satisfy the UN Global Compact principles and report candidly. Not enough of them, but I can give you, if you're interested, some examples of reports that I actually think are excellent. And I've also met with management of some of these companies, and I do believe that these companies, where the leadership is engaged, they really are trying to make a difference. The supply chain programs and information, I think, do allow response that has not been previously possible. As I mentioned, there are win-win scenarios. So, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. If a company can reduce its emissions, it can reduce its costs, so it's a win for the environment and a win for the company. Productivity gains are also win-win scenarios. So they're logical choices for companies to focus on. Institutional investors are really promoting very hard that these areas, management of environment, human relations and so forth, that the institutional investors are realising that this is part of the commercial valuations of companies, and that's why they're requiring companies to report. Yep, my time's up. 5 minutes, okay. And so that's why companies are increasingly aware of their brand and the reputational risks. And there's mounting evidence of actions by highly influential actors, both state and non-state based. And it's really law that's lagging. Law is now really just following what's already happening in the marketplace. So what are the challenges? There are many. The largest companies are the companies that typically control these supply chains. And there are real power and information asymmetries often between them and their suppliers. And inevitably, it's the controlling company that determines the agenda. In other words, often the material issues that are being managed are those that are most important for the company and that are going to influence the valuation of their company. So, for example, they want to manage the customer response and so forth. And they're not necessarily the issues that are most material from an environmental perspective or from a human rights perspective. It can often be the controlling companies that are seeking to reduce their costs, and they can actually then push the pressure down the supply chain and say to their suppliers, I need you to reduce costs and make them accountable for it rather than taking the burden themselves. And so they can shift responsibilities, accountabilities and legal risks downstream. And so that means that it can be just a bit of a smokescreen, or it can actually be quite effective depending on the motivations of the companies involved. So in terms of my conclusion, I think supply chain management and reporting can assist to fill important informational gaps and indeed some legal gaps. But it is limited by the commercial parameters. If it's being driven only by things that are going to produce commercial returns, that means that there are going to be obvious environmental issues, human rights issues and so forth that aren't dealt with because they're not going to provide any commercial return. It relies to work well on the commitment and goodwill from the relevant companies. And so in practice, there's this big spectrum. There are some companies that, in my view, are doing it just from a public relations exercise to those that are genuinely striving to change. I think what's most exciting is that it works best when the law is working in the same direction as what's happening in the marketplace. Okay, so where you've got state and non-state actors, and they are becoming quite clever and are working together in groups and collaborations and on an international basis, I can see real change happening. And the environmental groups are becoming quite clever at using every market mechanism available, but and they're also starting to use legal mechanisms like shareholder resolutions, disclosure reporting. They're getting the regulators engaged. And so this is building. The momentum is building. And so the law definitely works best where it's working in harmony with these state and non-state actors. So there are promising things happening, but there's also real challenges. Thank you.